The wind howled across the open land, sweeping snow along the ridges and scattering it across the valley floor. The night was bitter, the kind that could freeze water in a cup within minutes and make even the strongest men shiver under heavy blankets. Thomas sat inside his tent, a small canvas shelter that had been his home for the last 3 weeks. He had built a fire just outside, and the heat from the glowing embers seeped faintly through the thin walls, but still the cold seemed to creep into his bones. He pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders and leaned forward to adjust the lantern, casting a warm flicker of light across his rough wooden crate that he used as a table. Thomas was not new to this life. As a trapper, he had spent many winters in lonely camps, setting his lines by rivers and checking snares in the woods. He had grown used to silence, used to hearing only the crackle of firewood or the distant cry of an owl. This night felt no different, at least until he heard something unusual. It was faint, almost lost in the sound of the wind, but his trained ears caught it. The crunch of footsteps on snow. Not the heavy stride of a horse, not the scurrying of a coyote, but the uneven step of a person. He froze, holding his breath, listening. Again the sound came, slow, cautious, almost hesitant. He reached for his rifle, resting it across his knees, and waited. A shadow passed near the tent flap, and for a moment Thomas's heart pounded. Then, with a trembling hand, someone pushed the flap aside. A girl stood there. She was wrapped in a thin blanket, her dark hair tangled from the wind, her face pale with cold. Snowflakes clung to her lashes, and her lips quivered as if she had not spoken for hours. Thomas could see she was young, maybe no more than 16 or 17. Apache, he thought instantly, recognizing the features and the way she carried herself. She didn't move closer, only stood half inside the tent, her small frame shivering so hard the blanket shook around her shoulders. Thomas lowered his rifle slowly. She wasn't a threat. She looked exhausted, half frozen, and in desperate need of warmth. "Come in," he said gently, motioning with his hand. She didn't answer, but her dark eyes flickered with relief. She stepped fully inside, and Thomas closed the flap quickly to block the biting wind. The girl went straight to the fire, crouching beside it. She held out her hands, and Thomas could see how red and stiff her fingers were. She had probably crossed water, he guessed, maybe even the icy river half a mile from his camp. Her shoes were soaked through, and her blanket looked damp. She must have been wandering the wilderness for hours, maybe longer. Thomas reached into his pack and pulled out another wool blanket. "Here," he said, holding it toward her. She looked at it carefully, as if unsure whether to accept, but finally took it and wrapped herself tightly. He poured some hot water from his kettle into a tin cup and handed it over. Steam curled into the air, and she warmed her fingers around the cup before taking small, careful sips. Inside the tent, silence filled the space. Thomas studied her cautiously, not wanting to scare her with too many questions. He knew only a little of the Apache language, a handful of words he had picked up while trading. After a long pause, he tried. "Name?" he asked, tapping his chest. "Thomas." Then he gestured toward her. "You?" The girl only shook her head. She pulled the blanket tighter and lowered her gaze to the fire. Thomas did not press further. She was frightened, perhaps suspicious, and surely weary from the cold. He leaned back, giving her space, though he couldn't help but wonder why she was out here alone in such dangerous weather. The minutes passed, the fire snapping now and then, the lantern flickering softly. Slowly the girl seemed to relax a little. Her shoulders loosened and the shaking of her hands eased. Thomas noticed something then. She had a small leather pouch tied with a thin strip of rawhide, hidden beneath her blanket. She kept one hand, pressed against it protectively, as if guarding it from sight. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Clearly she carried something of importance. He pretended not to notice, turning instead to stir the pot that hung above the coals. It held rabbit stew, a simple meal he had prepared earlier. He scooped some into a tin bowl and pushed it gently toward her. "Eat," he said. The girl hesitated, but hunger won. She took the bowl, lifted the spoon awkwardly, and began to eat in small bites. Each mouthful seemed to bring a little color back to her cheeks. Watching her, Thomas felt a mixture of relief and curiosity. Whoever she was, fate had brought her to his camp that night. Outside, the storm grew harsher. The wind rattled the tent walls and snow piled higher against the edges. Thomas knew no one would be traveling through the valley until morning. For now, it was just the two of them, a stranger and a girl, sharing warmth in the middle of the endless wilderness. As she finished her stew, the girl finally lifted her eyes toward him. For the first time, Thomas saw not only fear, but also determination in her gaze. She pointed at the pouch beneath her blanket, then at the horizon beyond the tent. Thomas leaned forward, curious. She untied the pouch and carefully pulled out a small piece of carved wood. Symbols were etched across its surface. Apache markings Thomas could not read. She held it up as if to say, "This matters." Thomas nodded slowly. He didn't understand the meaning, but he understood the weight. This girl was not here by accident. She was carrying something important, something that needed to reach someone. For a moment, Thomas felt the night shift around him. What had started as an ordinary evening in camp, a night like countless others, was suddenly different. His tent was no longer just a shelter from the cold. It was a place where secrets now rested, where choices would soon matter. The girl tucked the piece back into her pouch, pulling the blanket close again. She leaned against the tent wall, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. Within minutes, she drifted into uneasy sleep, the firelight dancing across her face. Thomas sat, quietly, staring at her and then at the shadows flickering across the canvas walls. He could not help but wonder, who was she running from and what danger had followed her here? As the night deepened, Thomas realized his life had just taken an unexpected turn. He thought she had only wanted to warm up in his tent, but now he sensed her presence carried a story far larger than the cold. The morning sun rose slowly over the snowy valley, casting pale light across the frozen ground. Thomas stirred from a restless sleep, his breath visible in the cold air inside the tent. For a moment, he thought the events of last night had been a dream, but then he turned and saw her, the Apache girl, still wrapped in the extra blanket, sitting near the fire. She was awake now, her dark eyes fixed on him as if she had been waiting. She did not speak, but her gaze was steady. Thomas nodded to her, rubbing the sleep from his face. He poured water from his kettle into a tin cup and set it near her. She accepted it without hesitation this time. It struck him how quickly the silence between them had shifted. Hours earlier, she had been trembling with fear, and now she seemed calmer, though still guarded. As he chewed on a piece of dried meat, Thomas noticed her hand once again drift to the leather pouch beneath her blanket. It was as if she could not rest without feeling it close to her. He remembered the carved piece of wood she had shown him the night before. Those strange Apache markings had meaning, of that he was sure. And if it meant so much to her, then she must be carrying it on some important journey. He tried again to speak with her, using his limited Apache words. "Where go?" he asked, pointing to the horizon. The girl blinked at him, then tapped the pouch, then pointed west. Her movements were sharp, determined, like someone on a mission. Thomas nodded slowly. West lay the trail that led to small settlements, and beyond that, Apache camps hidden in the foothills. He wondered if she was trying to reach her people. If so, why had she been alone in the bitter cold? Why had she risked crossing a freezing river? Before he could think further, she suddenly tensed. Her head turned toward the distance outside, her body stiffening as though she had heard something. Thomas listened too. At first, he heard nothing beyond the usual wind sweeping across the valley. Then it came, a faint sound, muffled but real, the distant rhythm of horses' hooves. Thomas's jaw tightened. He pulled on his boots and stepped outside the tent, squinting into the pale light. Far off, almost hidden by snow clouds, he saw them. 3 riders moving along the ridge. They were too far to make out clearly, but he knew immediately they were searching. When he ducked back inside, the girl was already clutching the pouch tightly, her expression a mixture of fear and resolve. Thomas didn't need words to understand. Someone was after her, and whatever she carried was what they wanted. He crouched near her, lowering his voice. "They follow?" he asked. She nodded once, firm. Then she made a gesture, hands closing like fists, pulling apart, something breaking. Thomas guessed she meant trouble, danger. He ran his hand down his face. He was a simple trapper, A man who lived by his own work, not by getting involved in conflicts. Yet here he was, sitting across from a girl who carried secrets bigger than himself. He could turn her away, let her face her pursuers alone. But when he looked at her, young and worn by the cold, his conscience tightened. He could not do that. The riders did not come closer that morning, but Thomas knew they would circle back. The valley had only a few paths, and any traveler would eventually be found. He decided it was better to move before the men returned. He saddled his horse, a strong bay gelding that had carried him through many long winters. When the girl saw, she shook her head quickly as if refusing to burden him. But Thomas waved his hand. "No," he said firmly. "You ride. Safer." She hesitated, then climbed onto the horse, clutching the pouch to her chest. Thomas packed what little he needed, slinging his rifle across his shoulder. Then, with a final glance at the tent that had been his home, he led them away from camp, snow crunching beneath each step. The trail was hard, the snow deep in places, but the horse pushed on steadily. The girl said little, but Thomas could feel her eyes watching the horizon, alert to every sound. Once, when a hawk screamed overhead, she flinched, then quickly recovered, her jaw tightening. She was young, but she carried herself like someone who had faced hardship before. After several hours, Thomas stopped near a stand of pine trees to rest. The girl slid off the horse and stood close to the fire he built. As they warmed, she finally tried to speak. Her words were broken, mixed with English she must have learned from traders or missionaries. "You help," she said softly, her voice hoarse from the cold. Then she pointed at the pouch. "Message Uncle," Thomas frowned. "Uncle?" She nodded. Then with effort she added, "Leader, Apache." The meaning became clear. The carved piece of wood was not just decoration. It carried a message for her uncle, a man of importance among her people. If she failed to deliver it, something vital could be lost. Thomas leaned back, processing the weight of it all. He had thought he was simply offering shelter to a frozen traveler, but now he realized he had stepped into the middle of something far bigger, something that could mean peace or conflict in this unsettled land. The girl's eyes burned with urgency. She tried to explain more, but her English failed her, and Thomas could not understand the Apache words she used. Still, the message was clear enough. She needed to reach her uncle, and men on horseback were determined to stop her. By afternoon, the snow had lightened, but the cold grew sharper. They moved again, keeping to the cover of trees whenever possible. Once Thomas saw fresh tracks in the snow, hoofprints wide and deep. The riders were near. He pressed forward faster, urging the horse on. The girl clung tightly, her face half hidden in the blanket, her eyes scanning the ridges. Thomas admired her courage. She did not complain, did not beg for rest, only held her pouch as if it were her very life. As evening approached, they reached a rocky rise overlooking the valley below. Smoke rose faintly from a distant camp, too far to tell if it was Apache or settlers. The girl leaned forward, pointing eagerly. "Uncle," she whispered, though Thomas was not sure. Still, hope lit her face for the first time. They camped that night among the rocks, hidden from sight. Thomas kept the fire small, the smoke thin. He sat with his rifle across his lap, watching the darkness. The girl lay nearby, finally sleeping, though one hand never left the pouch. In the quiet, Thomas thought about how quickly life could change. Yesterday, his world had been simple: traps, snares, and firewood. Today, he was protecting a messenger whose secret might shape the future of the frontier. The wind whispered across the rocks, and far off, he thought he heard the faint cry of horses again. The chase was not over, but he knew one thing: he would not abandon her. The night among the rocks passed slowly. Thomas did not sleep much, his ears straining at every sound of the wilderness. The girl slept lightly, curling into the blanket, clutching the pouch to her chest as if it were part of her body. Now and then she stirred, whispering words in Apache that Thomas could not understand. Each time she shifted, the firelight caught the carving of the pouch's rawhide strap, reminding Thomas of the weight she carried. At dawn, frost coated the ground like glass. The horse pawed at the frozen earth, snorting softly. Thomas rose, stamping his boots to bring warmth to his feet. The girl awoke as well, her eyes clear and alert despite the little rest she had. Without a word, she motioned toward the west. She was ready to move. They set off again, weaving through the narrow trails that twisted down the slopes. The land grew harsher, with jagged rocks and leafless bushes poking through the snow. Thomas kept scanning the ridges above, knowing the riders were still out there. He felt it in his bones. Men who hunted in this country did not give up easily. By midday, the sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows across the valley. For a brief while, Thomas thought maybe they had slipped away unseen, but then he spotted them. 3 riders again. Black silhouettes moving against the white hills. They were farther behind but closing the gap. The girl saw them too. Her lips tightened and she held the pouch closer. Thomas pulled the horse off the main trail, guiding it through a dry creek bed where the snow was thinner. The horse's hooves crunched softly against stones, leaving fewer tracks behind. Still, he knew they could not hide forever. After some time, they stopped under the shelter of pine trees. Thomas gave the girl a piece of dried venison, which she chewed slowly, never taking her eyes off the horizon. He noticed how steady she seemed. For someone so young, she carried herself with remarkable strength. Wanting to understand more, Thomas tried again to speak with her. "Those men," he said, pointing toward the ridge. "Why follow?" She hesitated, then shaped her words carefully in broken English. "They want message." "Stop peace," Thomas blinked. "Peace?" She nodded firmly. "Uncle, talk with white men. Promise land, promise food. Bad men, no want. They stop. Kill message." The weight of her words sank in. The piece of carved wood was not just a family token. It was a message of agreement, a step toward peace between Apache and settlers. And the riders chasing her were likely men who profited from conflict, traders, mercenaries, or outlaws who thrived on unrest. If they stole or destroyed that message, trust between both sides could be broken. Thomas rubbed his forehead, exhaling slowly. He had not asked for this burden, yet it had found him. The girl's uncle was not just a leader. He was perhaps a man who could stop bloodshed. If this girl failed, many lives could be at risk. The girl watched him, her eyes searching his face as though trying to read his decision. Finally, she said softly, "You help." "Yes?" Thomas paused, then gave a slow nod. "Yes." For the first time, she gave a faint smile. It was small and fleeting, but it spoke volumes. Trust had been built. They traveled until the afternoon shadows stretched long. At one point, they reached a frozen stream. Thomas guided the horse carefully across, but halfway through, the animal slipped, crashing onto the ice with a sharp crack. The girl gasped, clutching the horse's mane. Thomas managed to steady it, urging it forward until they reached the bank. His heart pounded, not from the fall, but from the thought that the sound might carry far, and indeed it had. Within the hour, the echo of riders grew louder. Thomas led the horse into thick brush and motioned for silence. They crouched, breath steaming in the cold. Moments later, 3 figures appeared at the edge of the clearing. Their voices carried across the still air. Thomas could not make out all the words, but he recognized the tone. Harsh, impatient. One of the men dismounted, kneeling to study the ground. He pointed toward the creek bed they had crossed earlier. The others nodded, their eyes scanning the area. For a terrible moment, Thomas thought they had been found, but then the men mounted again and rode farther down the valley. Only when the sound of hooves faded did Thomas let out a breath. The girl, though frightened, remained calm. She touched his arm lightly, her eyes meeting his. That single gesture said more than words. She trusted him with her life now. As evening approached, Thomas decided they could not keep running blindly. They needed direction. He pointed toward the horizon where the smoke had risen the night before. "Your uncle?" he asked. The girl closed her eyes, thinking. Then she nodded. "Yes, camp near river." So that was their goal, to reach the river where her uncle's people were camped. It would take another day, maybe more, but at least now they had a destination. They made camp under a cliffside that night where overhanging rocks blocked some of the wind. Thomas built a small fire, its smoke thin and hidden. The girl sat across from him, turning the carved wood in her hands. She seemed lost in thought, whispering words in Apache. Finally she spoke. "Uncle, say, message bring hope. If not..." Her voice trailed off. She shook her head, eyes glistening but firm. Thomas leaned forward. "We'll get there," he said simply. She looked at him, her young face hardening with resolve. "We must." That night, Thomas could not help but think about the life he had chosen. He had come west to live quietly, to avoid the troubles of men and politics. Yet here he was, riding with a girl who carried the weight of peace between 2 worlds. Fate had pulled him into a story larger than himself. As the fire burned low, he glanced at the sleeping girl. She was strong, braver than most grown men he had known. He wondered what kind of leader her uncle must be if she believed in him so deeply. Perhaps this message was truly the key to something better. In the distance, a wolf howled, long and mournful. Thomas tightened his grip on his rifle and stared into the dark. Somewhere out there, the riders still hunted them. The journey was far from over. But one thing was certain: he would see this mission through no matter the cost. The morning after their stay beneath the cliffside came quietly, with a gray sky and a biting chill in the air. Thomas woke first, brushing snow from his coat and stirring the dying embers of the fire until they glowed again. The girl, still wrapped in her blanket, stirred soon after. She looked weary, but her determination had not faded. She sat up, tied the pouch tighter to her chest, and gave him a nod as if to say she was ready to continue. They ate little for breakfast, just a strip of dried venison and some melted snow for water. The horse shivered as Thomas saddled it, its breath rising like smoke in the freezing air. As they prepared to leave, Thomas's eyes scanned the valley again. He saw no sign of the riders, but that did not ease his caution. Men who chased for profit and power always returned. The day's journey began quietly. The trail wound through a narrow canyon, where the high stone walls pressed close on both sides. The sound of the horses' hooves echoed sharply, bouncing off the rocks. Thomas felt exposed, like a target in plain sight, but there was no other route. He urged the horse forward, his rifle resting across his lap. Halfway through the canyon, the girl suddenly stiffened. She raised her hand, signaling him to stop. Thomas obeyed instantly, his senses alert. Then he heard it too, a faint metallic jingle, the sound of tack and spurs carried on the wind. His chest tightened. The riders were near. Thomas dismounted quickly, pulling the girl with him. He led the horse into the shadow of an overhanging rock, pressing them close against the wall. The girl crouched low, clutching the pouch to her chest. Thomas positioned himself at the edge, peering around just enough to see. Moments later, 2 riders appeared at the far end of the canyon. They rode slowly, scanning the ground, their rifles resting across their saddles. Their eyes searched every crevice, every shadow. Thomas held his breath, his finger brushing the trigger of his rifle. If they came closer, there would be no choice but to fight. The girl squeezed his arm, her eyes wide with fear but steady. She shook her head softly, urging patience. Thomas understood. Shooting now would give away everything, so he waited. The riders paused, speaking in harsh tones, though the words were carried away by the wind. One dismounted, crouching low to study the tracks in the snow. Thomas's heart hammered as the man traced the prints with his gloved hand. Then, by some miracle, the man pointed toward the wrong side of the canyon. He mounted again, and both riders moved on, their figures shrinking as they disappeared into the distance. Thomas exhaled, his breath shaky. The girl released his arm, relief softening her expression. They waited a few more minutes in silence before daring to move again. By the time they emerged from the canyon, the sun had begun its slow descent, painting the sky with streaks of pale orange. They pressed on quickly, knowing time was against them. The girl pointed ahead often, guiding Thomas toward the river she had spoken of. He trusted her sense of direction, even though the land was unfamiliar to him. As darkness approached, they reached a rise overlooking the valley below. From here, the river could be seen winding like a silver ribbon through the land, its surface glinting with the last light of day. Beyond the river, faint smoke rose into the sky. The girl's eyes lit up. She pointed eagerly, whispering, "Uncle!" "Camp." Hope filled her voice, but Thomas's caution held firm. Between them and the camp stretched open ground. If the riders had tracked them here, they would surely strike before the girl could reach her people. That night they did not light a fire. They huddled under a cluster of pines for shelter, the horse standing close for warmth. The girl leaned against Thomas's shoulder, half asleep but unwilling to let go of the pouch. Thomas stayed awake, watching the distant glow of the Apache campfires. They were so close, yet danger lingered like a shadow at their backs. Just before dawn, the sound they had dreaded returned, hooves, fast and relentless, pounding the frozen earth. Thomas rose instantly, shaking the girl awake. She clutched the pouch, eyes wide, ready to move. The riders appeared on the ridge, dark shapes against the pale morning sky. There were 3 of them now, the same who had been hunting since the beginning. Their shouts echoed across the valley as they spotted Thomas and the girl below. Thomas wasted no time. He lifted the girl onto the horse and swung up behind her. "Hold on," he barked. With a kick, the horse bolted forward, racing down the slope toward the river. Snow sprayed up from its hooves as it thundered across the frozen ground. The riders gave chase, their shots ringing out in the cold air. Bullets cracked against rocks and hissed past Thomas's ears. He ducked low, shielding the girl as best he could, his heart pounding with each near miss. The horse galloped with desperate strength, its breath steaming in great clouds. The river drew closer. Thomas knew the crossing would be treacherous, but it was their only hope. Behind them, the riders closed the gap, shouting threats that carried across the wind. The girl clung to the pouch, her face set with fierce determination. They reached the riverbank, the ice thick but uneven. Without hesitation, Thomas urged the horse onto it. The animal slipped but regained footing, hooves cracking against the frozen surface. The sound was deafening, echoing across the valley. Halfway across, a gunshot rang out. The ice splintered dangerously near the horse's legs, sending cracks racing across the surface. Thomas urged the horse faster, praying the ice would hold. With a final desperate push, they reached the far bank, scrambling onto solid ground. The riders pulled up short on the opposite side, hesitant to risk the broken ice. They shouted in anger, firing shots that fell short across the river. Thomas did not stop to watch. He spurred the horse onward, racing toward the smoke that marked the Apache camp. The girl's face lit with relief as the camp grew larger. Figures appeared ahead. Apache warriors rising with bows and rifles in hand, their voices carrying across the morning air. The girl cried out, lifting the pouch high. The warriors shouted back, recognition sparking in their eyes. By the time Thomas slowed the horse at the edge of the camp, he knew they were safe at last. The girl slid down, running into the arms of a tall man who stepped forward from the crowd. His hair was streaked with gray, his presence strong and commanding. This was her uncle, the leader she had spoken of. The pouch was placed in his hands and he held it high for all to see. The warriors around him nodded, their faces solemn but filled with respect. The girl turned back toward Thomas, her eyes shining with gratitude. For Thomas, the journey that had begun as a simple act of kindness had ended at the heart of something far greater. The girl had reached her people and her message of peace was safe. Yet he knew the riders would not give up so easily. Trouble still lingered beyond the horizon. As the camp gathered around, Thomas realized his part in the story was not finished. He had thought the Apache girl only wanted warmth in his tent, but she had carried with her a mission that might change the fate of many. And now, whether he liked it or not, he was part of that mission too. The camp was alive with movement as the first light of day touched the valley. Apache families stirred from their lodges. Children peered curiously from behind their mothers, and warriors stood ready with watchful eyes. The moment Thomas and the girl arrived, the air in the camp shifted. As if everyone knew something important had happened, the tall man who greeted them, her uncle, held the leather pouch high before untying the strap. The crowd fell into silence. With steady hands, he pulled out the carved piece of wood covered in Apache symbols. His eyes scanned it, and then he looked up, his expression grave but relieved. He nodded once, lifting the piece for all to see. A ripple of understanding passed through the people, like wind moving across tall grass. The girl stood proudly at his side, her thin frame trembling not from cold but from the weight she had carried all this way. Her uncle placed a hand on her shoulder, murmuring words Thomas could not fully understand but could feel. They were words of pride, of acknowledgement. She had fulfilled her task and he honored her for it. Thomas remained a few steps back, his horse snorting softly beside him. He felt like an outsider, which of course he was. Yet the girl turned to him, her eyes shining with gratitude. She stepped forward, gently tugging his sleeve, leading him closer to the circle of people. For a moment Thomas hesitated, but the look in her eyes told him he belonged here, at least for this moment. The uncle studied Thomas carefully. His gaze was sharp, weighing the man who had helped his niece cross dangerous ground. Finally, the chief spoke in measured English, though his accent carried the rhythm of his people. "You protect her?" Thomas inclined his head. "Yes, she came to my camp. I gave her shelter, then I stayed with her." The chief's eyes narrowed, then softened. He extended his hand. Thomas grasped it firmly, feeling the strength in the older man's grip. "You do good," the chief said. "This message is peace. Some men do not want peace. You stand with her. You stand with us." The words struck Thomas deeply. He had never seen himself as someone who stood with anyone but himself. His life had been solitary, built around survival and self-reliance. Yet here was a leader telling him he had become part of something larger. Before Thomas could reply, a cry rose from one of the lookouts at the edge of camp. Riders. The three men had not given up after all. They had crossed the river and now appeared on the ridge, watching the camp like vultures circling a wounded animal. The camp stirred immediately. Warriors armed themselves, forming a line between the families and the threat. The uncle raised the carved wood in his hand, his voice booming across the open space, speaking words Thomas could not understand, but whose meaning was clear. The message has arrived. We are not afraid. The riders lingered on the ridge, clearly measuring their options. They could not attack the entire camp. They were too few, too far from help. Yet they wanted to show they had not failed entirely. One of them raised his rifle and fired a shot into the air, the crack echoing across the valley. Then, with curses carried by the wind, they turned their horses and retreated into the distance. A cheer rose from the camp. Children ran to their mothers. Warriors raised their weapons high, and the girl clutched her uncle's hand, relief pouring from her face. The danger had not vanished entirely, but the message had been delivered, and that was victory enough for now. Thomas felt the tension drain from his body. He realized he had been holding his breath since they entered the camp. He leaned against his horse, exhaling slowly, watching the riders disappear into the horizon. The girl approached him then, holding the pouch now empty but still precious. She pressed it into his hands. He looked at her in confusion. "This is yours," he said softly. She shook her head, her English halting but sure. "You part of story. You keep, remember?" Thomas's throat tightened. He closed his fingers around the pouch, feeling the worn leather warm against his palm. For the first time in years, he felt connected. To someone, to something, to a purpose larger than trapping or surviving. The rest of that day passed with quiet celebration. Food was shared, fires burned warmly, and songs rose into the evening sky. Though Thomas understood little of the words, the tone carried joy and relief. He sat among them, a stranger no longer shunned but welcomed for the role he had played. Later, as night fell and stars glittered above, Thomas walked to the edge of the camp where the girl sat gazing at the river. He joined her in silence for a while, the sound of water moving gently beneath the ice. Finally, she spoke. "Uncle say, peace soon. This message tell all. Promise of land, promise of food. No more fight." Her eyes shone with hope, but also with the weight of someone who had seen too much conflict for her years. Thomas nodded. "It is good, but there will always be men who don't want peace." She looked at him, her young face wise beyond its age. "Yes, but now more men want peace. That is stronger." He could not argue with her. In her determination, he saw a strength that reminded him why he had chosen to help. She was more than a messenger. She was a symbol of what could be: courage, hope, and resilience. As they sat there, the campfires glowing warmly behind them, Thomas thought back to the night she had stumbled into his tent, shivering and silent. He had believed she only wanted to warm up, nothing more. Yet she had brought with her a story that stretched far beyond the walls of his small camp. A story that touched the fate of her people and perhaps even the settlers too. The next morning, Thomas prepared to leave. He saddled his horse quietly, packing his meager belongings. The girl and her uncle came to see him off. The uncle clasped his hand again, speaking words of thanks. The girl stood silently, her eyes shining with unspoken gratitude. Before he mounted, Thomas reached into his pocket and held out the leather pouch. "This belongs to you," he said firmly. "I'll remember without it." The girl smiled softly, taking it back. She pressed her small hand against his larger one and whispered, "Friend." It was a single word, but it carried more weight than any speech. Thomas rode away then, the camp fading behind him, the rising sun casting gold across the valley. His life as a trapper would continue, but he knew he would never see the world in quite the same way again. He had become part of a story larger than himself, a story that began with an Apache girl stepping into his tent one winter night. And though he left the camp behind, the memory stayed with him forever. He thought she had only wanted to warm up by his fire, but in truth she had brought him a fire of another kind, the fire of purpose, connection, and hope.